Chapter 17. Sarah Connor's Estancia. The Present. Sarah Connor scanned again with the IR binoculars. The land around their estancia was vacant. Vacant except for several bats. Vampires, she thought. They were a menace to livestock here, especially when they carried rabies. And some armadillos, and a wild pig. Nothing human, or in the shape of a human. Nothing but the sound of insects and the hot, spicy scents of the Chaco brush. "If they're out there," Sarah said quietly, "they're very well hidden. Nothing but Dieter, and he's alone in that car. I've been tracking him for miles." "Maybe they're not out there," John said. "Maybe not," she agreed. "But von Rossbach is." As Dieter pulled up outside, she began to feel an adrenaline high, pulse and heart pounding, her skin overly sensitive. She noticed her hands shaking slightly and gave a disgusted tsk. These peaceful years had made her soft indeed. She took one last long glance at the ravine through her glasses, always the danger spot as far as she was concerned. They'd have filled it in years ago, except that then the house would probably be flooded every year when the rains came. Besides, she'd always thought they might find it useful someday for their own purposes. Now her tolerance of it seemed a fatal mistake. A car door slammed, and Sarah brought her attention back to the here and now. She tucked her glasses into a drawer, and John concealed his behind a curtain. Then she went to the door to greet their guest. Dieter pulled the car to a halt and sat for a moment, staring at the house through the dust and the remains of kamikaze bugs on the windscreen. "Why," he wondered, "am I doing this?" Over the years, he had met some criminals for whom he'd felt a certain sympathy. He acknowledged that sometimes circumstances drove individuals to insane extremes. But that sympathy and understanding had never kept him from hunting down and bringing to justice those who had broken the law. You couldn't simply let them get away with it. And yet, here he was about to go in and talk when he should have simply called the authorities and put in a claim for the reward. Why? Simply because Sarah Connor was a woman he was attracted to? No. He'd found some of the women he'd hunted over the years to be attractive, but never alluring enough to let them go. It could be that his every instinct said that Sarah Connor was a good person, one who could be trusted and, despite what he'd read, completely sane. Perhaps the reason was simple gratitude for breaking through the boredom that was crushing him into a reasonable facsimile of the cows he raised. Even before he suspected that she was Sarah Connor, he had found her intriguing. From the first, he had wanted to find out everything he could about her. "Then it's curiosity," he suggested to himself. "That must be it." So did that mean that when this curiosity was satisfied, he'd turn Sarah and her son over to the authorities? Something in him rebelled at the thought. This is senseless, Dieter thought, and opened the car door. You couldn't let people get away with the kind of destruction that Connor had helped to cause, and yet he knew that he would. knew they'd at least get a head start from him. He'd never even contemplated such a thing before. "Come on, boy," he said softly. An older puppy of mixed breed perked up its ears and moved from the passenger seat to the one he'd just vacated, licking its nose as it came. He lifted the puppy up and cuddled it against him as he slammed the car door. The porch light was on, but no one had come out to greet him. Odd behavior in this country where everyone was so hospitable, and Connor worked so hard to fit in. For one brief moment, he wondered if he was going to be shot the moment he crossed her threshold. The puppy wriggled slightly, then looked up at him, as though it had just wanted to remind him that it didn't like having its feet off the ground. Dieter spoke gently to it and walked slowly towards the portal. "Hello to the house," he said at last, uneasy at the lasting silence. "Hello," Sarah said from inside the darkened doorway. She saw the puppy and her brows went up. "May we come in?" Dieter asked. Sarah frowned slightly, as an ordinary working mother might at being put out like this. After a fractional hesitation, she opened the door. "Of course," she said, with a wry smile. She had stayed in the same clothes she'd worn to work, a full skirt in dark maroon and a simple white blouse. Dieter was no more formally dressed in khakis and a checked shirt. Just like the neighbors having a friendly visit, Sarah thought. If only that were true. John blinked at the sight of the dog in von Rossbach's arms and shot a questioning look at his mother over Dieter's head when he bent to put the puppy down. She shrugged in mute answer. "He's about 4 months old," von Rossbach said, "and housebroken. At least, he hasn't had any accidents in my house. But that could just be because he's afraid of Marietta." He looked up and grinned at John. "He's still young enough that you could give him a new name, if you wanted." John opened his mouth, then turned his head to the side. "I can't have a dog," he said simply. "You can't go your whole life denying yourself friendship or love or a dog, based on one experience, John." Dieter stood up. "He will be good company for your mother while you are away at school, and when you come home, he'll be here." Sarah and John locked gazes, then looked at him. "We need to talk," Dieter said simply. He moved into the living room and sat on the couch. "Sit down, Sarah." She walked over and took the basket of knitting that marked her place off of a side chair and put it on the floor. Then she sat, shifting slightly as the Uzi she'd concealed under the cushion dug into her backside. She looked up, startled. "What did you call me?" she asked. "Sarah." Dieter held her eyes with his. "Sarah Connor." John shifted slightly, squeezing his hands shut. The puppy noticed him and trotted over to give him a sniff. John squatted down and began to pet him, keeping a wary eye on the man on the couch. She opened her mouth to speak, and von Rossbach raised one big hand. "Don't bother to deny it," he said tiredly. "I know. I knew before Grigo shouted out your name." Sarah turned her head slightly, caught John in her peripheral vision, then looked back at Dieter. "What game are you playing?" she asked quietly. Sarah stayed perfectly still, hands in her lap, ankles crossed, but wanting to shout defiance, fiercely wanting to take him down, to punish him for this betrayal. Something in her recoiled at that, setting her off balance. She was glad she didn't have a gun in her hand at this moment, because she genuinely wasn't certain what decision she'd make. She'd brought her emotions back under control quickly. They needed to find out what this man was up to. Getting emotional wouldn't help them to do that. He shook his head, his eyes steady. "No game," he said. "Really?" Sarah asked, turning her gaze full on him. She glanced out the window behind the couch, but saw only herself reflected in the glass. The sun was already down, and dark had descended. "So you're alone?" "Except for Harold there," Dieter said, gesturing towards the puppy. "It's just me." John and his mother studied him in silence for a long time. "That's not the usual way for the sector to operate, now is it?" Sarah said, noting the slight flaring of his nostrils as he realized that she knew who he was. "What do they want, if not to arrest us and bring us in for prosecution?" "As far as I know, that's exactly what they want, Sarah." He looked her in the eye. "But I no longer work for them." John and his mother looked at him in open astonishment until the puppy got impatient with being ignored and butted him. John dropped onto his butt and began to massage the little dog's ruff. Sarah blinked at Dieter and tried to read his eyes. "Meaning?" she said at last. "Meaning that I don't have to jump when they whistle. Meaning that I believe there's something behind all that you did, that I very much want to understand. Meaning that I don't believe that you are a madwoman or a terrorist. I've met enough people of that stripe over the years that I can usually recognize them by their third meeting." He shook his head slowly. "There's something different about you." "So, you're just curious?" Sarah tipped her head to one side and began to drum her fingers on the arm of her chair. "Would you like some coffee?" "Yes," he smiled. "I would, thank you." When Sarah left the room, John didn't even attempt to talk to von Rossbach, but played with the dog. Dieter sat quietly, watching them and listening to the sounds from the kitchen. His mind was in a resting state, receiving input but not thinking about it, simply waiting. In about 10 minutes, Sarah returned bearing a tray with coffee and slices of pound cake. She put it on the low table before the couch and began to pour. John drifted over and sat in the other armchair. The dog lay down at his feet, bright eyes moving from one human to the other. When Sarah had poured them each a cup, they sat and sipped in silence, as though participating in some meditative ceremony. After a few minutes, Dieter put his cup and saucer on the table beside him and said, "Let me tell you how I found out about you. If you'll remember, our first meeting was somewhat dramatic." Sarah's full lips lifted in a half smile, and she nodded. I didn't believe a single word you told me, he said. She closed her eyes and shrugged. I didn't think you did, Sarah said. But I didn't know then that it would be a problem. I sent my old partner a drawing that I did of you and asked him if there was anything on file about Suzanne Krieger. Dieter went on to tell them about the information that Jeff had sent, explaining that Grieger was his friend's idea as well. It was when he sent me the case histories that I became confused, he explained. One time, you're fleeing the man with my face. The next, you're his accomplice. And then, when you first saw me, you bolted. And that was real fear I saw on your face. I don't understand. How could that be? And who is he, anyway? Sarah and John glanced at each other. Then Sarah looked at von Rossbach, her expression weary. You won't believe me, she said. I have an open mind, Dieter said. John snorted. Hey, I didn't believe her until the Terminator showed up. The man with my face, Dieter said. It wasn't a man, Sarah said. It was a machine. And there were two of them. The first one was programmed to kill me, the other to help John. Dieter nodded. He'd get back to that later. When it got you out of the asylum, why didn't you just run for the border then? Why go to Cyberdyne and kill Miles Dyson? I didn't kill Miles Dyson. Sarah's eyes bored into his. I couldn't. And in the end, I didn't want to. He was a good man and a brave one. The police killed him. Or at least they shot him enough times to kill him. She winced, her eyes on her coffee. I'd like to believe that, because it would make me less guilty. Otherwise, the explosion did it, but it was never my intention that he should die. Dieter nodded, then glanced at John, who was looking down at the pup, sound asleep on his foot. But why go to Cyberdyne at all? You could have gotten away clean, all of you, but you risked it all, even your son, to destroy a computer company. I don't understand. Sarah smiled to herself. She let her eyes roam her comfortable living room. This was so civilized. A nice chat about chaos over coffee and cake. If you know anything about this, she said, returning her gaze to Dieter, then you must have heard about Judgment Day. He nodded. Yes, I read about it in your medical records. Her brows went up. You've read my medical records? He nodded. Sarah grinned at his uncomfortable expression. Boy, I'd love to read them myself. They're very interesting. I'll bet they are, John muttered. A first-class piece of fiction writing. Science fiction. Horror, if you want to specify the genre, Sarah said, and smiled at him. Then she turned back to Dieter. I was never delusional, she said. Everything I said was true. The Terminators, Skynet, Judgment Day, all of it, it's true. You gave the date of the world's end as Dieter stopped speaking when Sarah held up her hand. We destroyed Cyberdyne because, according to the Terminator, Cyberdyne was going to create Skynet, and Skynet was going to start a nuclear war. By eliminating all of their records as well as the 2 items they harvested from the first Terminator, we eliminated their ability to continue the project. She settled herself more comfortably into her chair, which ended the threat. Sarah took a sip of her coffee. Dieter shook his head. What? John snapped, sitting forward in his chair, frowning. The pup lifted its head sleepily at his tone, with a muffled roof of protest, as its warm communion with the friendly human was interrupted. Von Rossbach continued to look at Sarah, who was staring at him, frozen-faced. Tell us, she said. Her scalp felt too tight suddenly, and the hand gripping her saucer turned white at the knuckles. They've started up operations again on an army base. An underground installation this time. I've also been told that they have recovered some item you were supposed to have stolen during your raid. Dieter watched the color slowly drain from both of their faces. That's impossible, Sarah said quietly. We destroyed those things, threw them into a vat of molten metal. She shook her head. There's no way they could have survived. The arm, John said, sounding strangely far away. When he came up the conveyor belt with the grenade launcher, he had only one arm left. He looked at his mother. There were all these wires and shit hanging out of the other sleeve. Sarah flashed to her feet, spilling the cup and saucer onto the floor, and looked around her as though there were a fire, but she didn't know where. Oh no, she said, pressing her hands to her head. No, damn it! She dropped her hands, clenched them into fists. How? How could they start up again? We destroyed everything. Everything! Even Miles's personal papers. He said that everything was there. His work, his team's work, all of it. She dropped into her chair again and stared at Dieter. How? She asked. They secretly backed up everything they had. Dieter told her. It's common procedure. They just didn't tell their employees that they were doing it. That way, the backup records would be safe. You can't even torture someone into telling you the things that they don't know. Sarah got up and began to pace slowly. She felt as though he'd just told her a loved one had died. Tears pricked at her eyelids and her throat grew tight. Get over it, she told herself fiercely. You have to move on. What are you going to do? Think. John sat in shock. He felt as though someone had punched him in the stomach, knocking all the air out of him. He watched as his mother paced as though she were in another dimension, smaller somehow, and far away. Then, as one, they turned to Dieter, the same expression on their faces. Dieter had felt it on his own face more than once, and had seen it on colleagues when they were faced with a job they loathed. But a job they would do, with a determination even greater than their hatred for it. between Asuncion and Villa Hayez, Paraguay, the present. Marco kept glancing at the Terminator until it asked him, "Why are you staring at me?" "It's just, you look... Do you know von Rossbach?" he asked. "Yes, he's my cousin." It continued to look straight forward, its sunglasses remaining in place even as the sun set. "Because you look just like him," Marco said. "Like twins," the Terminator agreed. "Except for our eyes. Those are different." Certainly its eyes were. They were glass, the very best available, but still noticeable, eventually, to even the most unobservant human. Hence the dark glasses. "Oh," Cassetti said. "Well, that explains a lot." This must be some family matter, he supposed. Dieter was probably getting into things they were afraid might disgrace the family. If he was freely consorting with gun runners and terrorists, they had reason to be fearful. "How much longer?" the Terminator asked. About 30 minutes, Marco said. "It will be dark when we get there." There was no answer from his passenger, so Cassetti mentally supplied one. Good. About 20 silent minutes later, Marco pulled the car off the main road and onto a narrow but drivable track. "If we go any further on the road," he explained, "they'll see us coming. There's a bit of a walk to the house, but I didn't think you wanted to be seen." "No." The Terminator sat unmoving, the case in its lap. That stillness was working on Cassetti, making him very uneasy. So were the bugs and the sounds and the indecipherable rustles and clicks. This wasn't how the world was supposed to smell or feel or sound. If the guy didn't speak occasionally and breathe, he'd have begun to fear he was dead. He'd read that ninjutsu taught its adherents how to be still, but this was something he imagined would make even them look fidgety by comparison. "So what's in the case?" he asked casually. "Surveillance equipment," it lied. "So I'm going up alone. It's very sensitive and I don't have much time, so I don't want any more interference than necessary. It's rented," the Terminator continued. "So you'll have to return it for me. We won't have time to go back to Grigo before my flight. My employer will pay you extra for your inconvenience." "Oh, hey, that won't be necessary," Marco protested, pleased. "She will insist." Cassetti nodded absently as he worked out a new scenario. So this guy was von Rossbach's cousin, but apparently no relation to the beautiful blonde who had hired him, because he kept referring to her as "my employer." Maybe what happened was that von Rossbach had stolen something that he was offering for sale to all these underworld types, and the blonde, who maybe ran an old family company that manufactured weapons or something, was trying to get it back before von Rossbach could sell it and put innocent people in jeopardy. And the cousin here was trying to recover his own family's lost honor by helping to bring his cousin to justice. Yeah, that worked. That sounded plausible. It had plot. He turned off the headlights and cut the engine, coasting to a stop. "The house is a quarter of a mile that way," he said, opening his door. "I'll find it," the Terminator said. You stay here. It would kill Cassetti at the airport, it decided. Unless there was noise during the termination of Connor and her son, and the human panicked. Yes, it would keep this resource alive unless and until it became inconvenient. There's a ravine over that way, Cassetti pointed. It goes right by their house and makes a good place to observe from. The Terminator looked in the direction the human was pointing and saw it immediately. Yes, it said. Stay here. And it moved off. On sight, it sent to Serena. Approaching target. Serena, at dinner with Jordan Dyson, was distracted for a fraction of a second. Understood. Continue. Out. She felt a little shiver of pleasure pass over her skin as she contemplated finally seeing the end of that miserable pair. As she looked at Dieter, Sarah could feel Suzanne Krieger falling away like an old coat. In a way, it was a relief. Even as she regretted the loss of her life here in Villa Hayes, she had to admit that Suzanne and her concerns were, well... Suzanne was a housefrau. Suzanne was content to vegetate in a small town. Suzanne is boring. She had opened her mouth to speak when a noise interrupted her. Growling. The puppy had jumped up onto all fours and its nose was pointed to the picture window towards the slatted vents above it. It growled again, a shocking sound from an animal so soppy-friendly and so young, and its slightly shaggy brown-grey coat was bristling, as if it had been plunged into a giant electrostatic generator. Then it barked, hard and hostile. Mother and son looked at each other with a dawning horror in each pair of eyes. "John!" Dieter exclaimed, pointing. "Down!" And he threw himself forward off the couch. In the split second before the big man's hands dragged him to the floor, John looked down and saw, centered over his heart, the telltale red dot of a laser sighting mechanism. A nanosecond before he moved, there came a sharp clack from the window, as though a pebble had been flung hard against it. A fuzzy-edged star appeared on the glass. Sarah hit the floor and crawled over to the wall switch. In the moment before darkness fell, she saw that Dieter had drawn a gun from somewhere. She hadn't even realized he was carrying. My God, I've slowed down, she thought bitterly. Friends of yours? She hissed, hoping against hope. A glance at the cowering terror and teeth-baring rage of the puppy as it backed towards the kitchen killed the hope that I'm being targeted by a ruthless, covert ops anti-terrorist agency. No, he snapped. Sector doesn't operate this way. It would be easier to simply arrest you, Sarah. And we definitely wouldn't deliberately target a 16-year-old boy. She didn't bother to answer. The window was suddenly peppered with bullets, like a flurry of giant hailstones hitting the glass. It didn't break, but crazed into an opaque wall. Bulletproof glass, he realized. Clever. And, as it turned out, necessary. John tipped over Sarah's chair, ignoring the hidden pistol, to rip out the fabric covering the bottom. Then he yanked the 12.7mm heavy Barrett sniper rifle out of the cradle that ran up its high, fan-shaped back, and crawled towards the kitchen, pushing the 6-foot mass of steel and synthetics before him. "Get ready," Sarah told him. "On 3. 1, 2, 3!" She flung a switch, and the outside yard was flooded with light. Dieter opened his mouth and then closed it again with a snap. These weren't civilians, and he wasn't in command of the defense against whoever it was that was trying to kill them. The feeling was reinforced as Sarah, he reminded himself to call her that, came leopard crawling back from the kitchen and ripped an M16 rifle with a scope sight out from under the cushions of the sofa. Even her body language had changed as she slapped back the weapon's bolt, still graceful, but with all the softness gone from it. "What have you got in the way of fixed defenses?" he said, for want of something better. "Floods," she replied briskly. "Israeli surplus personal surveillance radar, reinforced doors and windows with breaching alarms." Her eyes crinkled slightly. "Poor Dieter. I think you're going to get that proof you wanted, if we survive this." Then she shook her head. "No if about it. We have to survive." "I was planning on it," he said, and smiled. "In a way, I am relieved." "How do you spell relief?" Sarah said. Then, "Down!" Before the word, the hollow chunk of a grenade launcher had already sent Dieter diving for the cover of one of the heavy leather armchairs. As he pulled it over on himself, he saw Sarah burrowing under the couch. Here was a woman after his own heart. Badump! Flame and splinters of tempered armor glass and a wave of heat washed over him. Something stung his left hand. He sucked on the cut as he came up behind the thick chair, aiming his Glock out in the empty space where the big window had been. A figure stirred beyond the lawn and flower beds, moving. He squeezed off 2 rounds from his pistol, long range, but he'd always been a good instinctive shot. Sarah's assault rifle gave a spiteful crack, 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 firing on semi-auto, but rapidly. He saw the figure lurch and spin, something flying from its hand. "I knocked it down!" Sarah called, loud enough to sound like a shout, even to his battered ears. So John can hear, Dieter thought. "It lost the grenade launcher!" "Knocked it down?" Dieter said. "Did you hit him?" "It," Sarah said coolly. 5 rounds into the center of mass. Even body armor won't stop rifle rounds at less than 100 yards, Dieter thought. 5.56 rounds were high velocity, and they tumbled in a wound. That many would cut a man in half, spill his guts over the ground. "That'll put it out for a minute or so," Sarah said. "It'll have to reboot. Come on!" She'd fallen into English, unnoticed. Dieter reacted automatically, helping her push the heavy furniture into an improvised barricade against the ruin of the window. She stooped and threw the rug to one side as well. "Heads up!" came John's voice, faint down the stairs. "Won't he try another entrance?" Dieter said. "No. He knows John and I are here," Sarah said, with a bleakness that added years to the age her voice sounded. "And it will figure that the highest probability is to head straight for us. They're hard to stop." "They must be, if they can take 6 assault rifle slugs in the belly," Dieter thought. Cautiously, He peered over the top of the couch into the glare of the lights outside. An arm came over the edge of the retaining wall at the lower end of the lawn, holding the pistol grip of a rifle in one hand. Galil or Kalashnikov, he couldn't tell which. No problem, nobody could control. The rifle's muzzle began strobing red in the night, precise 3-round bursts. One by one, the floodlights died, and darkness settled over the estancia buildings. Darkness and more silence than usual. Many of the creatures of the night had prudently shut up when humans were hunting. Or things that look human, Dieter thought. Feeling the eeriness of that impossibly precise shooting clutch at his stomach. No time. Think about it later. Sarah slipped goggles down over her eyes, handed him a pair. He donned them, adjusting the strap for his larger head. Israeli manufacture, not the latest model, but solid electronics. The night turned a bright silvery green, and he could see the man. The Terminator, he thought, climbing over the edge of the wall, coming forward with the assault rifle in one hand and an Uzi in the other, using both as if they were light pistols. Just as the figure in the tape from the police station had done, the one that killed 17 armed men. The clothing across its middle was shredded, the fabric wet with blood. Beneath the gore, he thought he saw something shining. "How are we going to stop it?" he shouted. "Draw its fire!" Sarah snapped back. "I defer to your knowledge," he thought, and emptied the Glock at the looming figure marching towards them at a brisk walk. The bullets struck. He could see them hit, punching holes in the leather coat. The face was his own, but it didn't even twitch, just turned towards him like a turret swiveling, weapons coming up. A nightmare in which he tried to kill himself and couldn't. He ducked, and automatic fire chewed at the thick stone of the window ledge. Ricochets whined and howled into the house. Sarah thumbed the selector switch of her M16 to full auto, popped back up, and hosed the magazine into the approaching thing. It fell back, staggered, flopped onto its back, and began to move again. Dieter's mind gibbered as his hands went through the automatic motions of reloading. 16 rounds in a Glock, and he had only the one spare magazine. Perhaps if we pump enough lead into it, it will be too heavy to stand. Then a sound came from the floor above them. Brack! The Barrett rifle firing a heavy machine gun round with a slug the size of a man's thumb, designed for use against armored cars and military helicopters. Dieter had turned to fire again, feeling like he was using a child's slingshot. He saw the massive form of the Terminator fly backwards 6 feet and flop down. Brack! Another of the heavy bullets slammed into the thing's body. The Austrian felt his eyes going wide. He'd seen armored fighting vehicles blow up from less damage. Brack! Brack! The body lay sprawled 15 yards from the window, spread-eagled, weapons gone. Dieter suppressed an impulse to empty his pistol into it, and then go for a bulldozer and a load of concrete. He forced himself to take deep, slow breaths, the scent of cordite paradoxically soothing, an element of normality in this nightmare. There was blood welling from the ripped leather and flesh of the dead machine, he decided, but not nearly enough blood, and no bone fragments or coils of red-purple intestine. Instead, once again, he could see a gleam of metal, and now a spark as if something electronic was shorting out. "Well," he began, turning to Sarah. Her face relaxed as well. Then she looked over his shoulder, and her teeth showed in a snarl. "Fuck this!" she shouted, as he turned and saw the outstretched arms lift, the fingers flex, the face like a death mask wax of his own, rising to look at them again. One eye glowed red in the bloodied, shredded visage. "Fuck this dicking around! I'm gonna terminate that fucker!" Sarah was scrabbling at the floor where the rug had lain. Dieter watched incredulously as a section of floor came up. Sarah reached within, and the ripped cloth of her blouse showed a swell of flat female muscle as she lifted out the long tube within. It was fat, 88mm, and flared at the end with 2 hand grips, and an optical sight along the left side. The woman heaved it onto her shoulder and snuggled the rest home as she aimed. The Terminator was on its feet again, coming towards them with the stolid, unstoppable grace of an avalanche. Dieter slid down with his back against the wall, flinging his gun arm over his eyes and opening his mouth so that the overpressure of the backblast wouldn't thud, whoosh, shred his eardrums. Heat scorched him again, and a feeling as if he'd been hit very hard with a kapok-filled sack all over his body. Firing a recoilless rifle inside a confined space, even a big confined space, wasn't a very good idea. There wasn't any recoil because the projectile was balanced by a backward blast of hot, high-velocity gas. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Sarah tumbling over on her back, with the Carl Gustav launcher clattering away, and everything left standing in the big living room that hadn't already been overset flying as if a hurricane had struck. From the sound of it, the same thing was happening out in the kitchen, and there was a piteous whining from the puppy cowering under the cast iron stove. And out on the lawn, well, a Carl Gustav was supposed to destroy main battle tanks. The Terminator had taken the shaped charge warhead right on its breastbone, and a huge globe of magenta fire flared in the night. When Dieter blinked away the after images, the torso and legs were lying in a shallow crater, juddering with a horrible semblance of life. The skull, shoulder, and one arm of the Terminator were a little closer to the house. Most of the lower half of its face had been burned away, leaving a sooty residue on what looked like chromium steel alloy that had been burned bare and shiny in spots. There was enough that the eerie resemblance to his own face, the one he saw shaving every morning, was still there, and it made him want to scrub the flesh away with acid. Then the eyes opened and looked into his. They were dead, starred like broken marbles, but they saw him. The head moved, saw Sarah Connor. A jerk, and the arm moved too, reaching out, clawing fingers where flesh shredded away from the steel into the ground, pulling itself closer. Dieter gave a cry of loathing and shot again and again, but the mutilated thing didn't so much as glance back at him. Brack! He hadn't even noticed Sarah's son coming up behind him. Some detached part of his mind told him that was a sign that he was going into shock, a mental fugue state. The heavy slug slammed the Terminator over on what was left of its back. John's slight, teenage form swayed back with the recoil of the massive weapon, even then. Dieter could admire the boy's marksmanship, firing from the hip like that. Of course, if he fired from the shoulder standing up, it would knock him over. Brack! The vicious blue sparks of a hard point on steel, and the skull dropped from its severed metal spine. Brack! This time, the muzzle was close enough to the face of the killer machine that the muzzle blast burned more flesh from the eye. The bullet went in through the orbit and punched out through the rear, sending the metal bouncing into the night. "Well," John said, "so, that proof enough for you?" Dieter looked at him and at Sarah, climbing groggily to her feet, blood running from small cuts on her arms and skirt stripped away by the blasts. He looked down at the... Can't call it a corpse, he thought. It was never alive. "That," he said, "is more proof than I wanted to have." John laid the empty weapon down and made a grab. The puppy dodged past him, threw itself at the remains of the Terminator, and began to worry at its leg. The boy, young man, scooped it up. "And now you see why I can't have a dog," he said, and buried his face for a moment in the animal's fur. Marco sat in the car, whacking the occasional insect and waiting. His stomach felt like it was wrapped around a jagged rock. He wanted to pace, but didn't dare, lest it interfere with his passenger's equipment. And for the first time in his life, he actually wanted to smoke. He checked his watch. It had only been about 15 minutes. It just felt like it should be midnight. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. Marco heard a sudden pop, like a firecracker, and he jumped. Then there was silence. He stared expectantly into the darkness, as though he would be seeing fireworks any moment now. A flash and a hollow boom sound. Then there was another series of pops, and off to the side a bright light. It held steady. There were more pops, and the light gradually began to diminish. "Shots?" Marco said out loud, and instinctively knew he was right. He got out of the car and moved towards the ravine, then stopped, uncertain what to do. He was unarmed, and now there seemed to be shots coming from all directions. Cassetti shifted from foot to foot anxiously. Then he thought he should get the car started and be ready for a getaway. The big guy looked like he knew how to take care of himself. He'd come barreling down that ravine any second now, ready to jump in the car and make their escape. Marco got into the car and carefully turned it around so that it faced the track. He sat in the driver's seat, but he was so wound up his butt barely touched the cushions. He stared into the darkness, waiting, listening. "Come on," Cassetti urged. "Let's go! Cut your losses and get out of there, man!" Then there was a blast that blew a ball of flame over the low hill that hid the Krieger estancia from view. It was followed by complete silence. Gradually, insect noises returned, and Marco let out his breath in a great gasp. It was time to go, he realized. If his passenger had survived that, he'd have arrived by now, Marco set the car into careful motion, the lights still out, finding his way down the track by the scant light of the moon. He didn't turn the headlights on until he was a mile down the actual road, and then he sped up to a downright dangerous 40. His mind ran around and around like a cricket in a jar. Should he stop in Villa Hayes and tell the police? Surely they would arrest him. What were you doing out there? They'd ask. And what could he say? Oh, I was just bringing Senor von Rossbach's cousin out there to spy on him. Really? And why did you do that? It wouldn't do, he realized, as he drove past the town. Someone had died out there tonight. There was nothing he could do to change that fact. The only thing he could change by telling the authorities would be his own future, and not for the better. He would tell his client, and then that would be it. She'd have to get someone else from now on. He hadn't hired on for this. For all he knew, the big man was supposed to blow him away too. Marco's mind went still at that. He remembered Grigo's mysterious absence from his office, the intimidating man's too pat explanation for it. He gasped and stepped down on the accelerator, certain to his soul that he'd just escaped with his life. Suddenly, the restaurant business didn't look so bad.